Good afternoon, 10th grade. Time for world history. Let me get back over here to this screen. Okay, yesterday we had been talking about the Allied advances. We had talked in previous days about the Axis advances and how they had advanced into Europe. And then we talked about the mistakes they made, namely the Battle of Britain, the invasion of Russia, and the invasion of Pearl Harbor. Yesterday, we talked about the Allied advances. We talked about North Africa and how American troops and British troops came across from either end of North Africa and drove the German, German and Italian troops out. And we began to talk about Normandy, and that's where we're going to pick up today. The leaders of the Allied powers were three. Of course, we had three countries. The U.S. was led by Roosevelt, Britain was led by Winston Churchill, and Russia was led by Stalin. Those leaders are pictured here in this slide. Churchill and Roosevelt met together at Casablanca, and then just a few months later, all three met at Tehran, which is in Iran. The Casablanca meeting was in January of 1943. The meeting of the three in Tehran was held in late 1943. I'm not sure exactly what month. But at that point, when they three met in Tehran, they were trying to agree on what they were going to do next about invading Europe. Now that Germany had taken over most of Europe, including France, how were they going to go back in? Stalin wanted to make sure that he got control of all of Eastern Europe. So he strongly said, we're not going to invade through Eastern Europe, because he didn't want American and British troops in Eastern Europe. He wanted to keep that for himself. So he talked Roosevelt into agreeing with him. So they planned an invasion through France. So that's what they're going to do. The Normandy invasion, also known as Operation Overlord, invaded the Nazi-held territory through France. Now, this was an invasion like no other invasion in history. So it was going to take quite a bit to deceive the Germans and make sure they didn't know it was coming. So they went so far as to build fake troops and station groups of troops in places where the Germans felt sure they would be able to figure out where the invasion was coming from. They thought it was going to come at Calais, which is near where Dunkirk is. So they had all their troops amassed at Calais. They were ready for an invasion, and that's not where we invaded. The D-Day invasion took place on June 6th, 1944. It was the greatest amphibious, meaning from water to land, like a frog does, an amphibious operation in history. Over 10,000 planes were used to get soldiers onto the beaches at Normandy. 5,000 large ships, 4,000 small ships. In the 3 weeks following the Battle of the landing at Normandy, over 1 million soldiers landed on the beaches there. They didn't all land for the initial Normandy invasion, but over a 3-week period, 1 million soldiers. That is enormous amount of manpower. And the date of that invasion is a date you need to remember, June 6th, 1944. But the Germans continued to fight even after this German invasion, and we're going to look at that on the next slide after we look at some pictures of what the Battle of Normandy looked like. There's 5 different beaches here at Normandy. You see from the drawing on the right, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. All of those beaches were invaded. Soldiers come on. Of course, paratroopers had been sent over to land behind the lines and prepare the way for the troops that landed from the water. It was just an enormous invasion. There's a really good movie done in the 70s called The Longest Day. Stars John Wayne, old American movie actor. Um, it's a really great movie if you want a good one to watch for your movie review. But they show a lot of detail about the D-Day landing that you can't get in other places. So why did the Germans continue to fight? They were defeated. They had 1 million men standing up against them. How were they going to win this war? Well, there were 3 reasons that they really continued to fight despite the fact that all the odds were against them. And the first one is they really believed in the new miracle weapon coming out. Now, that new miracle weapon was ultimately going to be the atomic bomb, but they didn't finish it in time. But there were several steps leading up to it. They had the V1 rockets, the V2 rockets, and all kinds of different things. And all of these things that they threw at the Allied powers, nothing worked. Nothing was good enough to stop the Allies because we were determined to rid the world of Nazism. The second reason that the Germans continue to fight is that Hitler and his group of advisors really believed that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin would not continue to get along, that eventually we would split. And it was probably going to be Roosevelt and Churchill versus Stalin because Stalin was just incorrigible. He was very, very difficult to deal with. Okay. So he expected that to happen, but it didn't. And that is to the credit of men like Churchill and Roosevelt that they were able to get along with Stalin. And the third reason that Germans continued to fight despite insurmountable odds is their fear of Russia and communism. They had spread rumors throughout Germany, and Germans were terrified of communism coming to Germany. And that kept the Germans fighting even when it didn't make any sense for them to do so. Okay, I am trying to get a lot of material done today, so I'm very sorry I'm talking so fast. I'm probably not going to finish it anyway. Let's go back to the Pacific Theater and talk about what's going on in the Pacific versus Japan, and then we'll come back and finish the war in Europe. Pearl Harbor's been bombed. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japan continues fighting different islands in the Pacific. They go from island to island, spreading out and conquering different places. One of those places that they conquered was the Philippines, and the United States was a territory of the United States, okay, at the time. Douglas MacArthur was the leader of our forces there in the Philippines. And they decided that they couldn't defend all the islands because there's hundreds of islands in the Philippines. So they concentrated their efforts on Luzon, on just one island, and trying to hold on to it. And even that eventually fell. As a result of the fighting at Bataan, Luzon, Corregidor, we end up with the Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March was American soldiers who were captured and forced to walk close to 100 miles through the jungle to a Japanese concentration camp, prisoner of war camp. It was brutal, and many of the men who were forced on that Bataan Death March did not make it. They died in the process. I used to have a man come to my classes and talk to them about the war in the Philippines, and he took part in this Bataan Death March. He did not want to talk about that. It was very difficult for him, and he has since gone on to heaven. I knew him in Virginia. There were many Japanese victories, but what happened is the Pacific is a very big place. And by the time Japan had conquered a number of these islands across the Pacific, they were spread so thin that they couldn't defend all of their islands that they were holding at the same time. They had gone in and conquered Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, as well as the Philippines and other islands. They were taking over. They had forces in China. So they had everywhere, and they had just overextended themselves to the point that they could not defend it all. So at this point, the United States, which is the main, right, there's not really any other allied troops over there. There's Australia and New Zealand have come to help us out. There's some Canadian forces there, but for the most part, all British soldiers are in Europe, and Stalin has not declared war on Japan yet. So that's where we are. We're just trying to make it. Okay. So we begin a strategy called the island hopping campaign. And in this campaign, we're making strategic choices about which islands to get. We want to make ones where we can land airplanes and that we can hold on to without great loss of life. And so we don't want to have to fight great numbers of Japanese to get them. So we have a couple of battles that your notes are here are not going to go into, so we need to go into them. First of all was the Battle of the Coral Sea. This was one of the first battles that was fought over no land. It was ship and air only. There was no land involved in the Battle of the Coral Sea. This battle, Coral Sea, is what saved Australia from being occupied by the Japanese. At this point, Japan knows they can't go any further. They cannot advance into Australia. Then there was the Battle at Midway. There was recently a new movie made about the Battle of Midway. It's pretty good. I've seen it. Midway was an American naval base, and at the battle, just before the Battle of Midway, Americans finally broke the Japanese code and knew what the Japanese were planning. And that was key because we knew they were going to attack Midway. We were able to actually attack first and put Japan on the defense. It made a huge difference, and we actually ended up winning. And from this point on, Japan, from the Battle of Midway on, Japan will constantly be on the defense. They will not be a winning country anymore. So we're going to make strategic choices about which islands we attack, but we still have the Japanese people are such fierce fighters, and we have two big groups of problems from them. Number one is the banzai charges. These are when a whole group of Japanese troops will get together. Some of them will even end up with makeshift weapons because their weapons have run out of bullets or whatever, and they attack an infantry position. And Americans are going to have to fight their way out of that. Banzai charges. The second one is kamikaze pilots. Most of us are pretty familiar with this term, I think. This is a pilot who loads his plane down with bombs and guns and things that will explode and purposefully runs his plane into an American ship, committing suicide himself. He knows he's going to die. But he does this to hopefully defend his homeland. Eventually, MacArthur, in the fall of 1944, is able to return to the Philippines and capture it back. Two particular battles while I'm running out of time. Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These are two particular areas where Americans fought, where the fighting was extremely heavy and extremely hard. But both of these islands put us within flying distance of the mainland of Japan. And they were very key, sorry, I went back too far. Very key to our success in Japan. All right, we'll pick up there tomorrow.